To understand how the Dallas police radio system was used in the assassination of John Kennedy, it is necessary to understand some of how the radio system operated. And in 1980, the Federal Bureau of Investigations talked to Captain Bowles. Well, maybe he was Sheriff Bowles at this time, I don't know. But anyway, Bowles provided them with details on how the radio system operated. And these 2 pages from that report describe how the system operated. And basically there's 2 important things for the purposes of this video to understand. This is one of them. 2 Motorola receivers were utilized operating on 45.74 megahertz. One was located on the Jefferson Tower building in the 200 block of West Jefferson, Dallas, Texas, and the other was located on the Stoneleigh Hotel, Dallas, Texas. These were connected by dedicated telephone line to the dispatch center. So there's 2 receiver stations, and also the lines entered a select switch to enable muting of either receiver. What this means is the dispatcher can, at his discretion, mute one of the receivers if he wants to. So I think a visual helps to understand this situation, and I made this superimposed upon a Google map. We have Dealey Plaza in blue, we have the dispatch center in purple, and we've got lines drawn to the receiver stations, one on the Stoneleigh Hotel and one on the Jefferson Tower receiver. So when units communicate with the dispatch center, they are not transmitting signals that are received at the dispatch center. Their signals are received at the receiver stations, at the Stoneleigh Hotel and the Jefferson Tower receiver. Doing it this way gets them more coverage with more reliability. They could, you would think, when I first looked into this, I just assumed they had an antenna on the dispatch center and that they received radio signals there. But that's not what happens. There's no antenna on the dispatch center. I think there is a backup antenna, but it's not used normally in the system. So the units are not directly communicating with the dispatch center when they transmit, but they are their transmissions are received by these remote receivers, and then the signal goes over cables to the dispatch center. Presumably they were run on the telephone poles. So there's 2 centers that receive signals, and the dispatcher has the ability to mute either one of them at his discretion. Now I've added to this graphic, near the Stoneleigh Hotel receiver, a motorcycle transmitter producing interference. If this were to happen, and I think this is what did happen, it doesn't have to be in exactly the location I chose there, but if you have a motorcycle transmitter jamming the signal at the Stoneleigh Hotel receiver, then the Stoneleigh Hotel receiver isn't going to function very well, because that transmitter is close to it, even if it's the same power as all the other mobile units. Because it's very close to the receiver, it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to hear other units through that receiver. You would still be able to hear units through the Jefferson Tower receiver very well, probably almost the same as normal, but you wouldn't be able to hear much of anything through the Stoneleigh Hotel receiver. Now in this graphic I have added an effect to represent the jamming signal of the motorcycle producing the interference with these radiating lines. Note how the way I've drawn it here, these radiating lines produce interference at the Stoneleigh Hotel. but they do not produce interference in Dealey Plaza. Now, in a situation like this, the dispatcher wouldn't be able to receive transmissions from the Stoneleigh Hotel receiver, but he would still be able to receive them from the Jefferson Tower receiver. And in a situation like this, you might use the muting switch to mute the Stoneleigh Hotel receiver, because you would realize that you have some kind of problem with that receiver, and you might not be able to hear everybody down from the Jefferson Tower receiver, but at least you could hear anybody down there without being confused by the signal from the Stoneleigh Hotel. So in a situation like this, you would expect the dispatcher would probably mute the Stoneleigh Hotel receiver. But if, on the other hand, he muted the Jefferson Tower receiver, then he wouldn't be able to hear anything but static. He wouldn't be able to hear anything but the jammed signal at the Stoneleigh Hotel. And that's what happened during the assassination. The dispatcher muted the Jefferson Tower receiver. And this made it so that he would not have to answer any calls, and his signal is much stronger. If he had to answer calls, then his signal would be strong in Dealey Plaza. And he doesn't want his signal strong there, because the whole point of this is so that the assassins in Dealey Plaza, with their relatively low-powered walkie-talkies, can easily communicate with each other without them being received on the Stoneleigh Hotel receiver, where they would be transmitted to the dispatch center and recorded on the dictabelt recording. That's the plan here. The plan is to knock out the Stoneleigh Hotel receiver here with interference, to shut off the Jefferson Tower receiver, so the assassins in Dealey Plaza can communicate without being recorded on the dictaphone machine, or the dictabelt machine. Now, they were recorded on there, but the noise is so strong that you can't hear most of their transmissions without noise filtering. And there's a few you can hear anyway, but the plan was not to be able to hear any of those, because they knew this was going to be recorded. Now, of course, there is evidence that is consistent with and supportive of this theory that I'm saying. And I'm going to start here 7 minutes before the assassination, where the dispatcher tells Unit 243 that his radio is about out.
Okay, 243. Who's clear? 23. 243. 3 clear, 1223. 243, you clear? Yeah, 243. In full clear, 1223. 243, your radio is about out.
Now, if you want to think that the dispatcher is simply telling 243 that his radio is breaking up, you can think that. But for one thing, I think there's a note of slyness in the dispatcher's voice, like he knows this isn't just a radio breaking up. This is the radio that's going to be providing interference for the assassination.
243, your radio is about out.
Not only that, later on in the radio traffic, 243 is identified as Patrolman B.L. Apple, and he says he's on a three-wheel motorcycle at that time, and the interference was created on a three-wheel motorcycle. And also, Patrolman Apple, his number, if you look over on the left there, this is Dallas Police information that says what these numbers mean, what they refer to. And 243 is in the accident supervisors and investigators number range. But patrolman is the foot soldier rank. So he's not a supervisor or an investigator if he's a patrolman. And usually accident supervisors and investigators are in cars. They're not in three-wheel motorcycles. So there's a lot of ambiguity about this, and it just so happens to occur just before the radio interference begins. So I think this is really the guy who's providing the radio interference, whether or not it's actually BL Apple. And now we come to the point where the dispatcher muted the Jefferson Tower receiver, as I was talking about before.
10-430. He's
That oomph sound he makes is him throwing the switch to mute the Jefferson Tower receiver. And as soon as he throws the switch, the dispatcher's signal immediately drops off the table. And the reason is that at that time, the dispatcher's signal was not being received at the Stoneleigh Hotel because of the interference. It was being received at the Jefferson Tower receiver. So immediately when he throws the switch, you can't hear him anymore because he muted the Jefferson Tower receiver. And this fact is covered up in the Bowles transcript here. Bowles, who made this transcript, has 1038 say, 10-438, are you still en route to court? Are you still en route to court is not on the recording. You can't hear that. Whatever you do, you use noise reduction, you still won't hear it. But Bowles wrote it in the transcript because he knows that 38 said 10-4 afterwards. 38 would not have said 10-4 unless the dispatcher had said something beyond 10-4-38. He wouldn't have said 10-4. It's only if he asks him another question that he's going to say 10-4. So Bowles knew the dispatcher asked him another question. I don't know if he knew that it was, are you still en route to court, or if he just made that up. But he put that in there so that the transmissions would make sense. Sure, if you're listening to the recording, then you know he didn't say that. But if you're just reading the transcript, as almost everybody was, then you would see this all makes sense. So Bowles is covering up the fact that the dispatcher's signal suddenly disappeared by writing in something that you can't hear on the recording. And they're covering up the fact that the dispatcher muted the Jefferson Tower receiver. But as I will demonstrate here, even though after the dispatcher throws the muting switch, you can't hear the dispatcher anymore, you can still hear 38 after that happens.
10-430.
And the reason you can still hear 38 is because he's at near Market Hall, which is right up near the Stoneleigh receiver. So 38's signal is much stronger at the Stoneleigh Hotel than the dispatcher's signal is. So even though you can't hear the dispatcher anymore after the Jefferson Tower receiver is muted, you can still hear 38 because he's near enough to the Stoneleigh Hotel. And then a little bit after the assassination, Patrolman Gross, number 83, calls in, and he's calling in on Channel 2. And he says dispatcher on Channel 1 seems to have his mic stuck. And 6 minutes before that, he had been out at 3200 Southwest Moreland. So here I've got where 83 said he was out. He's down in the area of the Jefferson Tower receiver. So if he's saying if he thinks the dispatcher has his mic stuck, then what that means is he called in and the dispatcher didn't answer. And it also means he doesn't think it's a matter of radio interference. He doesn't think the problem is an open mic. And that means the radio interference is practically nothing where he is. He doesn't think that's the problem. He just thinks the dispatcher's mic is stuck. And what that means is the radio interference is up north near the Stoneleigh Hotel, and the dispatcher has muted the Jefferson Tower receiver. Otherwise, the dispatcher would hear 83 Gross calling, and he would presumably answer him. But because he doesn't hear him, he doesn't answer, and Gross doesn't hear the interference. So this is all consistent with my theory, we'll call it, that the radio interference was created up by the Stoneleigh Hotel. Also, I have MH Market Hall here marked out. That's where 38 was. So you can see how close he was to the Stoneleigh Hotel, and that's why you can hear him still on there when you can't hear the dispatcher. So I've proven it here. The Dallas police sabotaged their own radio communications so the assassins in Dealey Plaza could talk to each other undisturbed.